Good morning and welcome to Birding Basics. My name is Carolyn Knight. I run the education and outreach programs for the Santa Clara Valley Audubon Society, and today we're going to be taking a close look at two of our families of birds that are found throughout North America and in fact the world. Now, last week we were discussing variations on the themes of ducks, and this week we're going to be taking a look at some birds that are going to remind you very strongly of chickens. And the reason for that is, in fact, the wild ancestors of our most common domesticated barnyard animal are the jungle fowl, who are in fact members of the family Phasianidae. So if you're noticing a lot of shared characteristics with chickens, you're on exactly the right track. These birds are members of the order Galliformes, which basically comes down to our terrestrial game birds. Now, the reason I call them game birds is because it's important to note that many of the species in both Odontophoridae and Phasianidae are involved in hunting. They're game birds. They are birds that historically and currently are considered good for eating. And there is a reason for that we are going to go into. But whatever your ethical considerations with regards to hunting are, it is important to note that oftentimes hunting can be a good ally for conservation efforts. People care about what affects them, and if you have a society or a community which relies upon certain animals for hunting purposes, for the purposes of feeding themselves, there's a vested interest in protecting not just those animals, but the habitats they rely on. We see this particularly with North American waterfowl, one of the very few groups that did not see a marked decline in these past couple of decades in terms of population numbers, and one of the primary reasons for that population stability is that they are very closely managed for the purposes of hunting. Their habitats are protected because people have realized that if you remove those habitats from existence, those animals don't have anywhere to live and they won't continue to exist, even if your interest in keeping them around is to hunt them. In terms of ethical management, you want to be able to protect those animals and the habitats in which they rely on to keep them healthy and present. So, why are we looking at two families today? The reason for that is because they're part of the same order, the Galliformes, and they're very similar in terms of structure. These birds are occupying very similar ecological niches no matter what part of the world that they're in. We do have a size variation, but it's not nearly as wide of a variation as we see with the ducks and the swans and the geese that we were talking about last week. And because of that, the field marks, the things that we're actually able to notice when we're out looking at them through our binoculars, those are going to be highly visible to us, and there's going to be a lot of shared features. Now, obviously, there's genetic differences between them. We're comparing two families instead of just two species that share a genus, or even two different genuses within a family group. But you're not going to be sequencing DNA out in the field. If you are, I would love to hear about your resources in order to do that work. But for most of us that are just out birding, that's way beyond the realm of possibilities. So let's take a look at some of the examples that we have here in North America so we can get a feel for the basic body shape and how these birds are actually put together. So the first bird we're going to take a look at is the wild turkey. Now, many of us have encountered these birds before out in the countryside. If you're particularly unlucky, they're a neighborhood bird for you. And I say that because these birds have zero fear of cars or people. I attended college in the Central Valley, and it was not an uncommon experience to be going to class in the mornings and find that there was an entire flock of wild turkeys that had just kind of set up shop in the middle of an intersection. Nobody wanted to get too close to them, whether you were in a car or on a bike or, heaven forbid, actually trying to walk by them. They can be a little aggressive, and they're very large birds, so that aggression is slightly more startling than if you just have an angry Buick's friend hovering around your head. The next bird is one that's not actually native to North America, but it has been widely introduced for the purposes of hunting, and that's our ring-necked pheasant. Now, this is the male. The females are a little bit less brightly colored, and by a little, I mean quite a bit. But we've got that very similar heavy body shape. They've got long, strong legs. A defining characteristic of both birds, both of the families, is that they're terrestrial game birds, right? They're going to be spending most of their time on the ground, though they are capable of flight. They're just not super great at it. The willow ptarmigan is a native member of the Phasianidae. Ptarmigan are mostly northern bound, and a really great adaptation that they share that actually differs from the rest of their family is that their feet are fluffy. They've got the same strong terrestrial-based feet. They're doing a lot of walking around, but because many of them are living in conditions that are exceptionally cold, I'm talking snow on the ground, permafrost conditions, their feet are covered in feathers. They're absolutely adorable, but it's a very important adaptation. So those fuzzy feet are helping to keep them alive. And it also gives you a really distinctive field mark to look for in case you're not sure whether or not you're looking at a ptarmigan. Now, moving on to our Odontophoridae family, we've got the California quail. Now, these little guys, many of us have probably stumbled upon if we're hiking up in the foothills. You're never quite sure if there's a quail hiding in the brush unless you stumble right on top of it or unless you hear it calling in the distance. But when you do stumble upon them, they flush out, which means they're making a ton of racket. They're moving very quickly to get away from you. But they wait until you are right on top of them, because otherwise their goal is to just hide. Now, we do have some differences between the males and females. The male is the more brightly colored one. He's got that beautiful slaty gray, it's almost a blue coloration on his breast that the females lack, but you'll notice that she's got many of the same markings. They're just not quite as brightly colored, and it's in shades of browns rather than the bluish gray and the sharply defined black and white. Another great example of the Odontophoridae family is the northern bobwhite. Now, these are more of a Midwest, East Coast species. We don't really get them here in California, but once again, we've got a very similar body shape. These are ground-dwelling birds. We can see that really short beak and a short tail. They're kind of shaped like Nerf footballs. And we get a little bit of variation between the males and the females in these, but it's, once again, not super obvious. But that dimorphism is an important key to keep in mind. So, let's talk about shared characteristics. One of the first ones I want to draw your attention to is, once again, precocial young. The babies of both of these families are ready to get down to business pretty much as soon as they hatch. Now, our top picture is a baby turkey, and then below we have a baby quail. Now, both of these birds, when they come out of the eggs, have feathers. They're not feathers suitable for flight, but they are sufficient to keep that bird warm and to help it camouflage in its environment. These are terrestrial birds, so they're going to be spending a lot of time on the ground. Under brush, they're going to be trying to blend in with the rocks and the dirt, and the patterns on them, whether it's spots or stripes, are going to reflect that need to camouflage. They're highly mobile. They're capable of feeding themselves. They're going to stick around mom's because she's going to be showing them where the best food sources are. She's going to be protecting them from predators, but for the most part, they're capable of doing their own thing. They're not going to be relying on mom to actually feed them. Also, it's always important to note when there are cute babies involved. Now, the feet of these birds is important to note. I did point out that the ptarmigan have feathered feet. For most of the birds in both Odontophoridae and the Phasianidae families, they in fact have scaled feet. These are the feet of a pheasant. So you can see they've got really heavy scales. They've got thick, strong, sharp claws. If anybody's had the misfortune of being clawed by a chicken, those suckers draw blood really easily. And the reason they have these is, one, they're terrestrial. They're spending a lot of time walking around, so they need to have feet that are protected from rocks or any rough foliage, thorns that they come across. And two, they're going to be scratching at the ground in order to get to things like insects and seeds. So they're going to be using their feet for a lot. It's important to note that one of the differences between members of the Phasianidae and the Odontophoridae families is something called spurs. Now, this is mostly males of the Phasianidae family, but if you see, there's a bony protrusion sticking out just above the toes on this pheasant's foot. This is a male pheasant. This is called a spur. They are sharp. They are used for self-defense, and these birds do get territorial. They do compete for mates, so they'll also be put to use for that. If you've ever wondered why cockfighting is a thing, it's because of these spurs. They're not very pleasant, but they are a feature that is notable and is worth noting and knowing about. Another common feature for these is the beak of these birds. Now, as we look at things like our California quail, our willow ptarmigan, even our wild turkey, which is a large bird, you're going to notice that their beaks are small. And I want to take a look at a bird called the chukar, which is an introduced member of the Phasianidae species, like the ring-necked pheasant. It was introduced to North America for the purposes of hunting. They're very noticeable. We occasionally see them wandering through Santa Clara County. But I want to take a look at this bird because its beak, that really distinctive chicken-like bill that's short, it's conical, it's kind of got a rounded tip, but it's nice and strong in order to crack open seeds and insects. It's bright red in the case of this bird, which makes it really easy to spot, and take a look at its shape. Now, this is a common shape. We see a lot less variation in terms of the beaks in the Phasianidae and Odontophoridae family than we did when we were looking at our birds of last week. Our ducks, our swans, our geese. There's less ecological variation between these birds. They're all pretty much taking up very similar or the same ecological niches in whatever habitat they're living in. And because of that, their foraging behaviors are very, very similar. The things they're feeding on are very similar. So we're not seeing the variation that we saw last week with regards to the beak structure. With Odontophoridae, there's a slight variation from the Phasianidae structure in that they've got a serrated edge on the sides of their beaks. The purpose of that is theorized to be for shearing through grass, but it's a very slight variation, and you would need to have the bird in hand in order to see that. Now, for most of us birding, that's not something that we're going to be doing. And as I mentioned before, sharp claws, you don't really want to be handling these birds unless you have to and are doing so for research purposes, to be frank. Now, I did mention that these birds are all capable of flight. They are, in fact. The domesticated birds, not so much, but that's because of selective breeding practices that have led to us having birds that are so heavy that they're incapable of carrying themselves in flight. But even birds like our wild turkey are capable of getting themselves off the ground. They are noisy as all heck when they do so. It's a lot of frantic flapping of wings, but they are capable of getting themselves up into a tree on top of a house in order to get away from whatever predator has startled them up. These birds have a type of flight which is called short burst flight. The characteristics of this are very strong flight muscles in the breast. Once again, I mentioned these are game birds. There's a reason why people like to eat them, and that's because they've got a lot of meat on them. And they've got relatively short wings for their body size. You can think of them kind of like the sprinters of the bird world. They can get where they're going fast, but it has to be a short distance. And there's nothing subtle or particularly graceful about it. I mentioned that oftentimes if you come across a covey of quails when you're hunting, you almost get to the point where you step on them before they flush out. That flushing, that sudden startling up where they take flight and they make a ton of noise and they nearly give you a heart attack because it was nice and quiet and peaceful when you were out in the woods or the hills, and suddenly you're, in the midst of an explosion of bird feathers. That is because of that short burst flight. They're not going to use it unless they have to because it's exhausting. They're effectively sprinting away from you. They're not great at it. They're going to prefer to spend time on the ground where they're nice and hidden, under grass or brushes. They're able to just forage quietly and stay out of view. But they have the skill necessary in order to do so. Something that's a little bit more behavioral is these birds tend to be gregarious. Outside of the breeding season, when the males are competing for the attention of females, we tend to see these birds in groups, larger family groups, coveys of quails. You'll see like a dozen babies all in one. So they like to gather up. They're not, at least for the most part, and this is a bit of a generalization, they tend to be gregarious. They tend to stick together in at least small groups. Now, the final thing to note about these birds is they are dimorphic. Now, we see this, the sexual dimorphism, in things like our California quail. As I mentioned, the male's more colorful, but we still see similar patterns in the females with the scaling that goes onto the belly, even that little tiny comma-shaped plume. We see it with the ring-necked pheasants. The males are much, much brighter than the females are. But one of the best examples of dimorphism comes from a bird that is part of the Phasianidae family. And the Phasianidae family got hit real hard with the sexual selection stick when it comes to evolution. They look ridiculous. So this is the male, greater sage grouse. It's a species that was at one point found throughout the Great Plains. At this point, they're a protected species. They've undergone habitat loss. Human interference in their lekking grounds has made it very hard for them to reproduce. They've been hunted. They've got a lot of stuff going against them right now. And then we've got the female below. And now you can see the similarities in shapes of these birds. Very small head, relatively long, strong legs, that heavy body shape that we saw when we were looking at the quails, when we were looking at the turkeys and the pheasants. But the males have these fantastic air sacs that they will inflate as part of their lekking behavior. The males for these species gather together in a group. They find a nice mound out in the middle of the plains, and they make noise. And it's almost a subsonic sound. It's very, very strange to hear. It's very low-pitched, it travels really well, and it draws the females in. The females don't have any of this craziness going on. They don't have the tail feathers that are quite that ridiculously spiky. They certainly don't have those air sacs that are inflatable and used for displays. And it is important to note that, as with most ridiculously dimorphic species. The flashier ones, in this case the males, don't do nearly as much parental care, if any. But that dimorphism, the ability to see which one's the male, which one's the female, pretty much right off the bat, is a handy characteristic for these birds, and is something that they share, although of course it's far more pronounced in the Phasianidae. Even if you're looking at domesticated chickens, you know which one's the rooster and which one's the hen, pretty much straight off the bat. So, with that, we've got that these birds are terrestrial. They prefer to be terrestrial. They are capable of flight, but it's going to be short. They've got short, rounded wings, relatively short tails, unless, of course, you're looking at the ring-necked pheasant, which, once again, almost runaway sexual selection going on there, that has resulted in a bird that's kind of ridiculous looking. Like, it's still capable of surviving, but it's got some stuff going on there that you're looking at and you're like, I think that's maybe more of a handicap for survival than an advantage. We've got very strong, relatively long feet, small heads, and with regards to comparisons to their bodies, which are large and heavy. They have got developed flight muscles, but to the point that those flight muscles can actually kind of hinder the bird in terms of just the weight that they add versus strength. Now, today, the neighborhood bird I want to talk about is the wild turkey. And as I mentioned, if these are, in fact, neighborhood birds for you, they can and frequently do cause some problems, but they are very widely spread. Most of that is actually from humans taking these birds and distributing them around. They are, in fact, native to North America. They were first domesticated in Mexico by the Native American tribes there, and then from the 1500s on were spread by European travelers pretty much wherever they went. These birds as a whole, whether it is the male that we're looking at here or the female, are a kind of bronzed green iridescence that's actually far prettier than you would expect for something that has the reputation of a turkey. The small head that is characteristic for members of the Odontophoridae and the Phasianidae families is made even more distinctive by the fact that these birds don't really have feathers on top of their heads. The males, as we can see, especially here with them displaying, do have a little bit of that runaway selection. They've got what's called wattles. Those are those strips of flesh kind of hanging off their faces. For whatever reason, the females find that attractive. But they are very large terrestrial birds with long, strong legs that they do use to help them forage and to move around. You're going to be seeing barred feathers, whether they're on the tails or the wings. Now, with these males displaying, the toms as they're called, we can see that barring really well on their tails. From this angle, you can also see the barring that's present on the wings. So it's a different pattern. You'll occasionally stumble across the feathers of these birds when you're out hiking in the woods. They are, for the most part, open woodland animals. And so you've got a wide variety of feathers that you can see. That bronze to green iridescence, though, is a really good marker, especially if you're finding feathers that look like they're not necessarily used for flight, so they're going to be symmetrical. Those are those body coverts. And, of course, they've got a really distinctive call. We call the turkeys gobblers for a reason. But they're a great bird to be familiar with because they're so widely spread across the U.S. And it's nice to be able to have that bird that, even if you knew what it was, to be able to define it. Because as I've mentioned before, one of the ways you can make yourself a better birder is maybe if you can't get that ID down pat, down to the species of a bird, if you can at least figure out what it isn't, that's going to help you in practicing your identification and getting more familiar with the birds around you. So, with that, have an excellent rest of your week, and I will see you all same time next week.